Okay. Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to our program tonight. I'm Phoebe Gross, one of the program co-chairs for Sisterhood. And we are very, very lucky to have gotten this program with the author Joshua Greene with his new book, Unstoppable. And we have several different parts to the program. There's going to be a little video, there's going to be discussion, and there will be questions and answers at the end. Everyone who's registered will be getting a copy of the book. They'll be ordered after the program, and I don't know how long it will take them to get to Bethel, but everyone will be emailed or contacted to pick up their book at Bethel. For anyone who hasn't registered yet and wants a copy of the book, you do need to go back to the link that was given on the Bethel live stream page to connect you to this program. We will do the questions and answers afterward. I'm not sure, I guess you can put your questions into the chat and we will follow up with that at the end. And any other comments that you want to make can be put into the chat. And now we will get on with the program.
Thank you, Phoebe. I want to just start, before I introduce our speaker for the evening, I just want to take a moment to thank Phoebe and the programming team for the Sisterhood and of course, Sandy Gruenberg and the rest of Sisterhood for putting on tonight's program and for inviting me to be a part of it. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to moderate this evening's talk, and I had the privilege of being able to read the book in advance, which was a wonderful experience. It's really quite an amazing book. And before we begin, I just want to take a few seconds to introduce our author and speaker this evening, Joshua M. Greene, also the author of Justice at Dachau, The Trials of an American Prosecutor, is a renowned Holocaust scholar and filmmaker whose biographies have sold more than 500,000 copies worldwide. Greene is a popular lecturer who has spoken at the Pentagon and before the Judge Advocate General's College, and his documentaries on Holocaust history have aired on PBS and Discovery. He has appeared on national media outlets from NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross to Fox News, CNN, and more. It is my pleasure to welcome this evening Joshua M. Greene. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Rabbi Zach. Thank you for your invitation.
So, Joshua, I know that before we get started, it's probably wise for us to watch a little bit to get to know, watch a little bit of a documentary, about 16 minutes to get to know our Shoah survivor, whom we're going to learn so much about this evening, Siggi Wilzig, which we have now. So I'm going to play now for everybody a documentary. It is 16 minutes long, and it will give you a little bit of background and insight into the life of the person whom Unstoppable describes and uncovers such a rich life that he had through the camps and beyond. So I'm going to play that now for everyone.
longer I live, the more I remember. I'm trying to get away from the past, but it isn't possible. I am not liberated yet. I live in Auschwitz every day.
I was born 26 in Koyanke. It was West Prussia, about 155 miles northeast of Berlin. 4,500 people, and I would think there were about 1,500 Jews. My mother's name was Sophie, and my father's name was Isidore. My mother was an Orthodox woman. My father made a little living. He bought hikes with 2 horses and a wagon. In 1935, we left everything, and the next morning we were in Berlin. There was an immediate change when Hitler came to power. You had already the sons joining the Nazi party. Well, I was beaten up regularly. Kristallnacht, I was 12 years old. As a child, and you see synagogues burn, Jewish homes go up in flames, and the police not doing anything. It was like the end of the world. It was forced labor run by the army. It used to make lamps before the war, and I worked on a lathe. I was 14 and a half years old, and I worked 72 hours. How much more can you do? They called it evacuation. That was the word. For instance, I was picked up in the middle of the night, 2:30, 3 o'clock, from this Lampenweber, from this forced labor that I did. When the trains pulled up, I looked out of the window. I know we were going east. But going east didn't mean Auschwitz. We didn't know there was an Auschwitz. So we arrived the night of March 3rd, bitter cold. I saw flames coming out only about 150 feet away from the train. So I thought it was a brick factory. I didn't know that people would be burned and gassed. To have been born as a Jew in Germany, to get beaten, to get hard labor, all of that. But the gas chambers, no, that you didn't expect. Where 10,000 people could be gassed in one night. The smell, that is a little bit hard to describe because there is no other smell like this. Have you ever seen people being burned? Have you ever smelled them? Neither did I. You see in my arm what the Nazis did. 104, 732. The little triangle, only for Jews. The selection was really a dastardly, terrible situation. My mother was immediately murdered in the gas chamber. My father was badly beaten, and my father died in front of me. The Auschwitz one was the main camp. The main camp are brick buildings, block by block. And 10 was the experimental, where the women went in, and the women didn't come out. Please do not ask me what kind of experiment. I think the Germans had a word, unmenschlich, unhuman. How did I find a way to live? If you didn't find out what I found out, you would be dead. There was no other way. I looked for every opening that they could possibly use someone like me, and I overheard something about bricklayers. I became an instant bricklayer. I did it for about 6 months. They needed someone in the laundry. I never worked in the laundry in my life, but I got away with 3-4 months. How did you survive 2 years of Auschwitz? It was not my education, which I didn't have any. It was my brain, which I didn't have much. It was the hand of God. The death march began on the 17th of January. We left Auschwitz and we started to march 150, 160 miles. It was a combination of open cattle cars and walking. It was winter time. We huddled together. The first stop was Auschwitz, a major center for coal and for metal. When the doors opened, a sight that I will never forget. We were sent to Vienna, to Milk and to Steyr. Our marching ended in Mauthausen. And when we were taken into the small shower room, we actually felt you would be gassed when you hear the clicking of the metal. That's something that stays with you forever. Somebody pointed on top of a hill a uniform I'd never seen, the American khaki uniform. They broke down the gates. That's where I was liberated. I had fever and sickness and everything else. I weighed 82 pounds. I left Europe November 29th, 47, and arrived in America December 12th, 47. What kind of work did I do first when I came to this country? Next, I was the original glue sniffer, putting glue on the back of leather bags for $28 a week. Oh, next I became an experienced leather goods salesman. My mind was made up that I can sell better than anybody else. Naomi Sisselman. We got married March 1454 in the Little Hungary on Houston Street. The whole dinner was $12.95, including the glass of flour. In 6 or 7 weeks, I went from salesman to general manager. I ran the business and doubled it. What did I do next? I acquired control of Wilshire Oil Company of Texas, a little oil company. I bought it piece by piece by piece by piece. The Rothschild and me went to the bank, the Trust Company of New Jersey, a 100-year-old institution. I was only the second Jew to become a president of a bank. The Jews were not bankers. Maybe there were a couple of savings and loans, but not of major size. Commercial banking particularly was a fiercely anti-Semitic business. They think because I'm a refugee and because I never went to school, I didn't even graduate public school, that how the hell do I become a president of a bank? I did it anyhow. I'm the president of a $4 billion bank. I was born to be president. If there's an organization that has anything to do with the Holocaust, I address the organizations, I give money, and I insist that my children go. See, the people that speak about it, and we're not there, they have to take the best from books, from studying, from movies, from theater. But when you were there, at a young age, then it stays with you.
When I see what I went through and hundreds of thousands of others that are not here to tell you, so I speak for them. I have that right. I have that obligation to speak for them because we're a dying breed and too many people are telling you there was no Holocaust. Never can anyone describe the scene. If you hear it 1,000 times, the chances are you are not capable of believing it.
What kinds of nightmares do you have?
Very bad. Can't even talk about. It's something that is there. You are in Auschwitz every day. I'm going to tell you something that I don't think I ever said. As terrible as it sounds, I don't think I could live without the nightmares. It gives me the very ultra realistic difference between life and death. It shows me what life is now, particularly as a Jew, and that I didn't give it up, what I am. I wouldn't want to be anything else. If I would have to go through, God forbid, the same thing, I would go through the same thing as a Jew.
Wow, a truly powerful documentary and a glimpse into the life of Siggi Wilzig. So, Joshua, I guess my first question to you is that to be entrusted to tell someone's story, someone such as Siggi Wilzig's story from survival through success and life after Auschwitz, that's quite a I don't know if burden is the right word to carry, but it's quite a cumbersome responsibility. So could you share a little bit about that experience of being entrusted to share and tell Siggy's story?
Sure. It is the dilemma of a biographer. First of all, no life can be condensed into a 300-page book or a 16-minute documentary. When we deal with people who have survived the worst of history, that obligation becomes multiplied and made more complex for a variety of reasons. Not the least of which is that the slightest error in reporting the events of the Holocaust feeds denial. And for Siggi Wilzig in particular, there was an absolute necessity of getting the details right. You know, a good friend of mine, Professor Larry Langer, whom I've had the privilege of working with at Yale University at the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, once commented that the Holocaust is being reduced down to a name, a number, and a place. The name is Mengele, the number is 6 million, and the place is Auschwitz, and that's more or less what people know. So the question then becomes, how do we focus attention on the details of the Holocaust? And Siggi came to America and dedicated the balance of his life to clarifying, preserving, and perpetuating those details of the Holocaust, not because he was morbid or because he was somehow fixated on horror, but because he knew that, first of all, people have to overcome their own disbelief over the depth and the extent of the horror that occurred. And secondly, without understanding the details of the Holocaust, we leave ourselves vulnerable to its repetition. So as trying to be a responsible biographer, my job was made manageable, first of all, by Siggy's children, his son, Ivan, his daughter, Sherry, and their brother, Alan. Ivan and Sherry in particular spent months going over every page, every paragraph, every line in the book to assure that the details were accurate, that their father's life was being properly represented. And I remember going through, chests and drawers and bins of material that had been preserved from their father's life. And now it gets more complicated, because if you haven't met the subject of your book, you have to cobble together, you have to piece together the personality you're dealing with from other people's accounts. So for Unstoppable, there were probably 100 interviews over the course of the 7 to 8 years that this project required. Everyone remembered some things in common. They remembered what a volcano of a man he was. He wasn't very tall. Siggi Wilzig was less than 5.5 feet short. And he used to coif his hair up. He had a beautiful head of hair, and he would make sure it was raised up as high as possible, so it would bring him a little bit more on a par with other people. But he compensated for that lack of physical height with an absolutely gigantic personality. And everyone had a Siggi story to tell. He had a device when he would meet with business people, particularly oil and banking in the post-war years here in America, as he mentioned in the documentary, were particularly anti-Semitic industries. If he walked into a business meeting and he felt that anti-Jew vibe in the room. He had a device. He would roll up his sleeve, take off his jacket, roll up his sleeve and point to his prisoner number tattooed on his arm and shake a finger in their face and say, the last person to try to intimidate me was Hitler. He didn't succeed and neither will you. And then he put his jacket on and walk out. And more often than not, beat them at their own game. So for example, after he had built these two industries, Wilshire Oil and Trust Company Bank, the Federal Reserve tried to force him to divest one of those two companies by claiming that it was a conflict of interest for a non-banking person like Siggy to be the parent company of a bank trust company. Well, first of all, both companies were doing extremely well under Siggy's direction. He became the first person in US history to sue the Federal Reserve. The officers of the Federal Reserve are appointed by the President of the United States. This is an organization that oversees the finances of the world's largest financial nation. And here he is coming in and suing the Federal Reserve. I won't give away the ending. I won't tell you what happened. I'll let you read that in the book. But it's to say that he suffered fools and bullies poorly. And I think if he were here today, his message to your congregants and to people who may be reading his story would be, if you're fighting for a righteous cause, never give in to bullies. They're cowards pretending to be otherwise. I mean, this is a man who stared down the Gestapo. Forbes magazine did a profile on Ziggy and said, what's the Fed once you've stared down the Gestapo? So there were a lot of things about his story that compelled me to want to write it. I knew it wasn't going to be easy. And frankly, I was done. Zach, I think I had done about a dozen biographies prior to this book. Most of them Holocaust survivors, some on war crimes trials. And it was so depressing. It's such a dark period of history that my wife came up to me one day and said, you got to find something else to write about. This is not good for us. And I had my chin down to the ground and I was having trouble sleeping. So I said, okay, so I wrote a biography of the late Beatle George Harrison. He's someone I had the pleasure of knowing back in the 1960s and early 70s. And that was just pure light and brightness and happiness and joy. So when the phone rang 8 years ago, and it was Siggi Wilzig's son, Ivan, saying, you know, I've read some of your biographies. I think you're the person who needs to write my father's story. So tell me about him. And he said, well, he was a survivor of Nazi Germany. He went through 2 years of forced labor, and then he was in Auschwitz for 2 years, and then a dozen death selections for death, and then 2 death marches. And say, wait, Ivan, I'm sorry. Thank you for your complimentary appreciations of my books, but I don't think so. I'm only going toward the light now. I don't know more darkness. And he exploded on the other end of the phone. He said, you don't understand. My father was a beacon of light for every immigrant who ever came to America. He was a bright, a light of hope for everyone. And he went on, and I was like, okay. So I did some research, and Ivan was not exaggerating. I found that his father, Siggi Wilzig, really was one of the most amazing, unexpected, startling success stories of post-war America. And when I realized what a noble character he was and what he represented, I thought that was a story worth telling. So I've never felt so good about being yelled at, maybe I can put it that way.
I can only imagine, I mean, how hard it must be to continue to document stories of survivors. You know, as I was reading the chapter about Siggy's survival of Auschwitz, I mean, it was very painful for me to even read it. I had to put it down and come back to it. I mean, it was very, you wrote it so beautifully, and I think I felt in some ways like I could really picture his experience in my mind, and it was too much at times. So I can only imagine doing that for so many people. having that weigh down on you. And I guess the question that I have for you is that, you said one of the surprising things was on the phone with Siggy's son Ivan, was that, yes, Siggy had this terrible experience in Auschwitz and like so many other Holocaust survivors, but that he surprised you in the fact that he was such a success story coming to America after the war. And so I guess my first question to you really is, what was the most surprising thing about Siggy and all the research you did about his life and his journey? What was the most surprising thing that you learned and discovered about him?
I would say that the most surprising thing I discovered about Siggy was his wicked sense of humor and his absolutely volcanic love of life. I mean, this is someone who would get up in a restaurant when he's out to dinner with his family and start singing and dancing spontaneously in the middle of the room. And people would be leaning over and asking his children, does your father own the restaurant? They know he just loves his life. And he was a terrible joker. I mean, sometimes if he was feeling particularly good, he'd raise his hand and go, Heil Hitler. Making fun of his former Nazi oppressors was his way of saying, well, Adolf, I guess it didn't quite work out the way you thought it did. It was going to, did it? We're still alive and we're doing well and we're quite happy. And so that was a big surprise for me, that someone could come out of the darkest of dark times and have such ebullient, such effusive love of his life. And he when he wanted some relief from the nightmares, because he did have nightmares, he would go to places of extreme beauty. One of his favorite places was the Biltmore Hotel in Phoenix, Arizona, because the Biltmore is famous for its acres of sculpted flower gardens. They have something like 39 acres of sculpted flower gardens there. And he would just wander through the flowers. And it took something like that, something almost exaggerated beauty to balance the dark times that he had been through. Or the birth of a child brought him great joy. A wedding brought him great joy. And he had favorite songs. He'd sing, "To Dream the Impossible Dream." That was one of his favorite songs. "If I Were a Rich Man," that was another favorite song. So I developed a lot of affection for this man. I feel like I've known him all my life after having studied. The good news was that his son Ivan succeeded in getting the Spielberg Shoah Foundation to record his testimony just a few weeks before he passed away. Even though the Shoah Foundation had technically stopped doing the recordings of testimonies, and they were, by that point in 2002, they were into the cataloging. Ivan found out in a newspaper report that Spielberg was going to be at a fundraiser dinner in the Hamptons. So he bought tickets for himself and his brother and went out to this fundraiser and saw Spielberg talking with some people. And he had rehearsed really carefully, went up to him and said, "Mr. Spielberg, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this is very important. You must interview my father. He's dying of cancer. He's the most eloquent survivor you'll ever interview. And he's good friends with your friend Elie Wiesel. He's spoken at Elie Wiesel's classes at the university. Elie Wiesel brought him in as one of the founding members of the council for the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And my family will give a big donation to the Shoah Foundation as a thank you." And Spielberg said, "Well, technically we've stopped interviewing, but sometimes we make an exception. Give me your card and I'll be in touch with you." And sure enough, thank goodness, just a few weeks before Ziggy passed away, the crew showed up at his apartment in New Jersey and recorded more than 15 hours of testimony. That's one of the longest testimonies in the entire 52,000 testimonies that they have in their archive. So Ivan, when I first met him and I was trying to get out of doing this, he hands me a box, right? About yay tall transcripts of 15 hours of testimony. And I'm reading through this and I'm hearing Siggy speaking in his own words about what he's gone through. And I'm saying, this man embodies the kind of qualities I'd want for myself in my life. You know, the perseverance, the love of life, the humor, the creativity, the drive, the moxie, I guess that would be a good word, the moxie that he had. So I thought this was a story worth telling.
So I want to stay with that moxie for a second, because my next question for you is, you know, the odds against him were so intense and so severe. To, you know, one, making it out of Auschwitz and making it out of Nazi Germany is one thing, and making his way to America, but becoming the success that he became is a completely different story. So my next question for you is, how did he do it? Like, how did he survive it all? How did he survive Germany? How did he, and when he came to America, how did he become such a mogul? Like, what was it in him that you learned from the many interviews that you did, from his family, from his business partners, from the people that were intimately interwoven into the fabric of his life? How did he do it?
You heard him in that documentary give some of the answer to that question himself, where he said, you know, it wasn't education, which I didn't have. It wasn't brains, which I didn't have much of. It was the hand of God. He was a very religious Jew. And he once described that the only complication in his relationship with Hashem was the 1.5 million children who perished in the Holocaust. He said that I have a hard time there. He saw his own 5- and 7-year-old niece and nephew marched from the arrival platform to the gas chambers on arrival in Auschwitz. So he did credit God. He said, otherwise, why would a little shrimp of a guy like me survive such incredible odds? And this is a point of debate in Holocaust studies. I'll admit that to you. On the one hand, you don't want to say that survivors are somehow unique, that they alone embody the will to survive. They alone have this intrepid human spirit. Somehow they alone are exemplars of heroism and bravery, because by implication, what you're saying is the 6 million who didn't survive, they didn't have a human spirit. They didn't have the will to survive. You know, so if you listen to survivors, they don't talk about themselves as heroes. They talk about the unheroic things they were obliged to do just to stay alive. You know, the individual men and women and children went into this experience, and a few came out. And what we find is not unique heroes and heroines. What we find is decent human beings forced under extreme, inhuman circumstances to do whatever was necessary in order to stay alive. So that's an important thing to understand, is, you know, we dishonor the dead when we say that only the survivors somehow had a will to live. So we have to be careful about that. By the same token, and this was something that was driven home for me doing Siggy's story, there was some agency in the camps. Now, I say that going out on a bit of a limb, because the scholars at Yale will say you're on thin ice here. But I will say, I'll take this position, that Siggy was resourceful enough and intuitive enough He called his instincts fox-like, that he would figure out what to say, which way to go. For example, as you heard in the film, he heard guards talking about how they needed bricklayers. He knew nothing about bricklaying, but he walked up to them, which you could get killed for that. Talking to a guard in Auschwitz was a brazen act that would get you shot. But he walked up and said, I've had years of experience as a bricklayer. So the guards were saying, well, all right, let's not waste him. Let's put him to work. We need bricklayers. So he managed to stay alive. Then he heard other guards saying, we need assistance for the doctors in the hospital. And Siggy walked up and said, I had 2 years working as an expert doctor's aide before I came in. They sent him to work indoors, and because he was working indoors, he avoided catching pneumonia and dying. So, there's something to be said for a guy who had to learn those kinds of skills even early in life. He talks about being a 5-year-old in Krojanka, this village in West Prussia, where the Jew haters would be chasing him. One story he tells is that he would follow his father to a customer. He told how his father would buy and sell pelts and scrap metal. And while his father was preoccupied negotiating terms with a farmer, the farmer's sons grabbed Siggy by his legs and held him over a meat grinder. This was a waist-high metal meat grinder, and said, now we're going to make Jew meat. And they finally let him go, and he ran screaming out of the barn. And from that day on, he didn't hang out with children anymore. He hung out with the adults. And he studied how the adults thought and how they came to decisions. He'd watch the adults playing cards, and he'd figure out what the strategies were. So even from a very young age, let's say he grew up very fast. He had to grow up very fast in order to survive. Then coming to America, he was fearless and unstoppable. I think the name of the book is a very apt description. He was absolutely unstoppable. There wasn't anything that could hold him back from getting where he was going to go, because he'd come from the most extreme circumstances imaginable. So when he would meet, people who just wanted to kick him out or see him fail or whatever, didn't faze him one bit. And he always came up with some way. He liked to say that he built his bank the old-fashioned way, one customer at a time, by winning them over with his tall tales and his humor and his stories about his experiences during the Holocaust. So he had a personal relationship with people, and because they trusted him, they saw in him a man of integrity, an honest man who would do right by them. Look, if you've got 5 banks, right, and they're all offering relatively the same terms, who are you going to go with? In Trust Company, you had access to the president and CEO of the bank, who said, I will personally take care of your account. That was how he built his companies.
Wow. Yeah. That comes alive in the book. When you describe that. I want to shift gears a little bit to something a little bit more personal about his family life. I think that a lot of people in our community could be able to see themselves in Siggy's story. Either we have a lot of people in our community who are either themselves Shoah survivors or are the children of Holocaust survivors, and they could see themselves in Siggy or Siggy's children. Can you share a little bit about how the Holocaust sort of framed his family's experience, and not just that, but tacking onto that, did he have a message for his family or for the people that were intimately involved in his life, his friends, that he would want us to know, that he would want us to hear?
Well, let me start with that second half first. Yeah, you bet he had a message for people. It is study the Holocaust. Study the Holocaust and never stop studying the Holocaust. Teach it in high school, teach it in college, teach it in your community groups. Because when you stop teaching the Holocaust, that's when you open your doors to every imaginable kind of danger and horror and tragedy we can visit upon one another. You may remember the footage, Zach, from January 6th when the people were storming the Capitol building. The man with that sweatshirt with the words Camp Auschwitz printed on it with the death head insignia. You know, racism and anti-Semitism, you know, didn't die with Hitler in his bunker in Berlin. You know, they're at the heart of all of the tragedy and anger and violence that we've been seeing in America for the past several years. So he would want people to study the Holocaust. He would want people to be aware of what had happened. And so far as how it affected his family, that was your question, right? Well, let's say that if someone has not grown up the child of a survivor, it may be difficult to understand what a miracle child you are. You know, survivors would, I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't say survivors. There's such a thing as survivors as a generic category. There are individual people, each of whom had his own particular response to the experiences of his or her life. In the case of Siggy, he wanted his children to be strong. He wanted them to be educated. And he loved them. Boy, did he love his children. When they were young, he used to go into their bedrooms at bedtime and kiss them 3 times. He says, I kiss you 1 time because you are my child. I kissed you a 2nd time because you're my child. And then as I kiss you a 3rd time for all the millions of children who never were able to be kissed by their parents when they went to bed. So, and any opportunity he got, you know, he would sit down with his kids, and when they would watch television together, it was usually something from the History Channel, you know, something about World War II. And he wanted to make sure they had a first-rate education, so they all went to the best schools. It's difficult living up to certain expectations. You know, I know. Let me go personal here. My mother was the daughter of a woman, my grandmother Sadie, who was one of 2 who survived. I think there were 15 in her family. They were all killed in the camps. And my grandmother was a disciplinarian. She was strict. She used to, you know, if my mother as a girl got out of line, my grandmother would take a coat hanger to her. Not because she was brutal, not because she was a sadist, but because she knew from experience what had happened to her family, that this is, don't be naive. Be strong, be vigilant, be alert, especially for a Jewish woman, you know, to grow up in this culture. She said, you've got to be prepared. You've got to be strong. You've got to be tough. You've got to be able to speak up for yourself. There was that kind of upbringing for Siggy and his children as well. He wanted them, because they're all very strong. They're 3 very, very strong personalities. They're very charitable people. Ivan, Siggy was a yeller. He was a screamer, right? He would get in your face. You know, his favorite word was schmuck. He's schmuck. Don't you understand? Everybody was a schmuck in his book. So when Ivan and I were working together, it took me a while to understand that when he was yelling at me, it's not just because he had some kind of a syndrome, you know, having grown up with a survivor father, but because he had learned from his father, if he made a point, if he had a point that was worth making, it was worth making strongly. And by gosh, you know, 95% of the time, Ivan's point was right. And sometimes he was right to yell because I had my own point of view. So where am I going with that? It's to say that it's a complicated thing, growing up with parents who have gone through those kinds of experiences. But I do wish to urge people to be very, very careful about drawing some kind of universal theme or applying some kind of a label like survivor syndrome. I personally have a very hard time with the notion of survivor syndrome. I think that's a kind of shallow way of trying to categorize something that defies categorizing. You know, and having worked with survivors for many years and having screened, I don't know how many hundreds of hours of testimony, I cannot say to you that I have ever seen something called survivor syndrome. I think there are certain shared experiences, but the way to honor survivors and victims is to recognize them as individual men and women. Honor them with the very thing that the Nazis took away from them, which was their unique personhood, their names, their hair, their possessions, their family members, their homes. You know, why treat them generically again? And I have a hard time with that.
Thank you for that. Yes. I have, you know, in reading the book, it was clear that that there was a major turning point in Siggy's life post-war. You know, he's building his family. He's laying the seeds, the foundation to build this massive empire with Wilshire Oil and with the TCNJ, and then he gets this invitation. You know, I think the documentary briefly said that we all watched earlier, briefly said this, but then he gets this invitation to speak to the cadets at West Point. And this was really, I think this was really this first time that he was invited to fully share his story in front of an audience that was primed and ready to hear it. And that really generated in him this lingering desire then to, following that experience, to continue to share his story. So maybe you can tell a little bit about what that experience was like at West Point, because I think it was so formative for him, and it was really a turning point in his life post-war, and how that experience grew and flourished over time and changed and shifted, and
Sure.
and what that meant to his life.
Right. Let me offer just a small corrective there. It wasn't the first time he had told his stories. He was speaking about the Holocaust very early on after he arrived in America. He never stopped. He was the first survivor to be invited to address the cadets and officers at West Point. So in that sense, it was a unique experience. And for Siggy, West Point was a particularly significant venue. If you know anything about the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, you know that it is the educational institution from which senators and congresspeople and presidents and ambassadors have graduated, generals, heads of the armed forces, many of whom came out of West Point. So his message to the students, the officers and cadets, was that one day one of you may become president. And therefore, it's important for you to understand the Holocaust so that you can be prepared to make sure that it never happens again. And he had photographic enlargements made of scenes from inside the camps at liberation. You know, we have an image of the Holocaust in black and white. There was color film in the 1940s. The reason why our image of the Holocaust is black and white is that the US Army Signal Corps, which was the division of the Army with the photographers, the cinematographers, who went into the camps first to photograph what the liberation forces found there, made an artistic decision. In particular, George Stevens, who later became famous as the director in Hollywood of The Diary of Anne Frank. George Stevens made the decision to shoot in black and white film because he thought that the starkness of black and white would be the most effective way of conveying to audiences who had no idea of what had transpired inside the camps, the depths and the scale of the horror that he was seeing there. Siggy had black and white enlargements made of photographs from the camps at Liberation that he brought with him to West Point. And for many of the young people there in particular, it was the first time they'd ever seen such stark imagery of what had transpired, what had happened there, the murder and the torture and the starvation. They gave him a 10-minute standing ovation. The New York Times reported his speech, saying it was moving and highly personal. Students came up to him afterwards and said, you know, Mr. Wilzig, we're big on imagery here. We're big on models and scales, bridges and you know, the effects of, you know, bombing runs and different equipment. This is the first time we've ever had a visual imagery of the Holocaust here. And one young man in particular with tears in his eyes said, I have to tell you, I'm feeling more deeply as a Jew now, having heard what you have to say, than I've ever felt in my life. And Siggy had that kind of an effect on people. He spoke from his heart. Very powerful. One of the interviews that I conducted said his verbal skills were Shakespearean. You know, you heard a little bit of a lecture he gave there in the documentary. Powerful. He knew when to gesture with his hands. He knew when to lean forward to kind of establish a kind of intimacy with the audience. He was a marvelous speaker, and he put those skills to use. Now, this is another big issue in Holocaust studies circles these days. You know, the Holocaust is approaching a time when it risks becoming another artifact of history, like failed revolutions and fallen empires and things from long ago. And with the survivor community getting smaller all the time, it's a big question. How will we preserve that memory? Who will tell the story? Which version of the Holocaust will they tell? Because there are many different versions. Through what media will it be told? Will it be film, poetry, novels, art, dance? With what intended effect on the audience? This is a big subject of discussion. And thank goodness we do have recorded video testimony, such as the one that the Shoah Foundation did of Siggi Wilzig, or the earlier testimonies that were recorded at the Fortunoff Video Archive at Yale. Video testimony and memoirs and biographies, such as Unstoppable, are a very powerful way of bringing those of us who were not there closer to the experiences of those who were.
Yeah, I mean, I know that as a rabbi in a community like Bethel, it's important for us to try to every year on Yom HaShoah and Kristallnacht to send out letters. I mean, like, but we can never really get the point, you know, and you can never really have enough testimony. I think like capturing that and preserving it, the memory of so many people who had an experience that most of us couldn't even fathom, is so crucial to not just the survival of the people who were not able to tell their stories, but also for the lesson that Sigi wanted us to take away, which is the idea that you can never let this happen again. So preserving those stories and testimonies is so incredibly important, and how we do that is vital. So I thank you for saying that, and also thank you for capturing so much of that in your book. I think it's really an important part of the book. I just want to make a comment that as we're getting close to the end, we're going to turn soon to questions from you, for the people who have come to hear tonight's talk. So if you have questions, you can start writing them in the chat. We'll call them together and ask them to our speaker Joshua this evening. So please feel free to do that. And in the meantime, I have another question, which is you know, you speak so beautifully about Siggy's relationship with Israel. We haven't really touched on that this evening yet, in a real way. I mean, we saw it in the documentary a little bit around the fundraiser gala that raised, I think, was $2.5 million for Israel bonds, and that was in 1975 or something like that.
But that was when 2.5 million was something.
Yes, yeah. But you know, I don't want to give too much away from the book, knowing what Siggy's personal journey to, you know, what like around Israel was like, but or not. And so I want to just like offer an opportunity for you to explain a little bit about how much Israel really played a role in Siggy's life.
He thought that was the greatest of all miracles, that the Jewish people finally had a homeland. Whatever occasion came up, whether it was a birthday or a wedding or whatever it was, among family, friends, Jewish, non-Jews, he was always planting trees in Israel. He must have planted 10,000 trees over the course of his lifetime. He wanted his children to visit Israel. I think, you know, there's a saying which we get wrong. It's don't judge someone until you've walked a mile in their moccasins. It's a Native American saying. So I think his point was, having known statelessness, this is what happened to us when we did not have a home. This is what happened to us when we did not have our own nation, our own homeland. That this miracle of Israel should occur for him was, you know, the greatest of causes to be supported. And you know, that extended to a lot of his life. When he was helping to build the Washington Holocaust Museum, for example, it was a big point of contention whether the museum should include other genocides. You know, what happened to the Armenians, what happened. And Siggy's point was, this is a uniquely Jewish experience. And for him, it was intolerable that the subject should be broadened, should be widened away from that for some arbitrary reason. You know, think about this, Zach. There have been many Holocaust study centers, Holocaust memorial centers that have changed their name over the years. They're now Holocaust and Genocide Study Centers, or Holocaust and Human Rights Study Centers, as though focusing on the Jewish specificity of the Holocaust is somehow wrong. You know, now I've taught in the universities for many years. I don't remember one instance when someone said, you know, if we're going to have a course on African American history, you know, we should include also the history of the Irish in America, and we should include the history of the Italians in America. Somehow that getting away from the Jewish specificity of the Holocaust is reserved for this one particular topic. And for Siggy, that was extremely objectionable. You know, there were many other people who were targeted for atrocities, targeted for death, but no one people targeted for complete annihilation other than the Jews. So the notion of a homeland, you know, when our people had been homeless for so many centuries, and for millennia, was for him the greatest of miracles. And he made that the cause that he gave his greatest attention to.
Yeah, I know. I think a lot of us feel that way about Israel in particular. The security it gives us as Jews to know that we always have a place to turn to if ever we were in trouble. There's something comforting in that, and I can imagine given Siggy's experience, how powerful that must have been to watch Israel blossom into the homeland of the Jewish people. So we have a question from Phoebe Gross. That is, first of all, thanking you for coming to speak with us and sharing Siggy's story. And how or what do you think Siggy would want to teach children about the Holocaust in the coming years?
Well, I think if you're going to use children in the broadest sense of the term, he would tell them, don't think that because you may not be Jewish, that this doesn't concern you. No, I'm African American, or I'm Hispanic, or I'm this, I'm that. This is only for the Jews and the Germans, maybe. They don't think like that. He said, hatred is an equal opportunity oppressor. And today it's the Jews, tomorrow it's some other group. And his story, Unstoppable, should be read by anybody who has any kind of a connection with an immigrant background. I think that's most of America. And he quoted Pastor Niemöller, who said first they came for the socialists, and I wasn't a socialist, so I didn't speak up for them. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't speak up for them. And then they came for the Jews. I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't speak up for them. And now they're coming for me. Who will speak up for me? Some deep, dark atomic core at the heart of human nature was exposed during the Nazi era. And we're still trying to figure out what it was. We're still trying to figure out what happened to us. What was it that allowed this kind of... I remember one survivor whose testimony is at the Yale Archive, who was 12 years old in Buchenwald, saying he remembers a guard walking by a guard, and the guard just slammed him on the head with the butt of his rifle and put him into a kind of a dazed condition for hours. And when he finally came to, he thought to himself, he doesn't know me. He's never met me. I don't know him. Where is this hatred coming from? Why does he hate me so much? And he said, there was a clean way of killing in the camps, and there was a brutal way of killing. And he said, I could never understand the brutality. Something was allowed to emerge, and I generally don't allow myself to go into politics. I've been doing a lot of these kinds of author talks here, but something over the last few years also was given vent. Some dark part of our human nature was allowed to surface. And I think Siggy's point was, this is not unique. This is not something that targets uniquely Jews. Be prepared. Understand that our humanness is fragile. It needs to be nurtured. It needs to be nurtured with education. It needs to be nurtured with acts of kindness and compassion and goodness. It needs to be nurtured by faith. And that's not a Jewish message. That's a message for everybody.
Yeah, it's a lesson that and you write, I think you write that way in the book. You really, I think you capture that in the book, that in the way that you write, that it seems like you wrote the book for everyone, in the ways that you just explain, the subtle things like that Mazel Tov is something that you say, it means congratulations at a wedding or a celebration. You really wrote the book for an audience that was not that beyond just a Jewish audience. So in some ways, I think you capture that desire that Siggy would have had to share the story with everyone in the way that you even wrote the book.
I want to give some of that credit to Ivan. He insisted that any time we'd use a word, any word, kosher, any word that maybe a non-Jew in some place in the Midwest wouldn't understand, we have to explain it. Let's educate them. You know, we're going to entertain them with my father's story because it's hugely entertaining. I mean, you know, frankly, there are times when he was a very, very funny man. But he wanted people to be educated. He wanted them to understand. So if there's a word, you know, ghetto, concentration camp, whatever, it's defined, it's explained for people in the book.
So we're running low on time, and I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to ask a question. This is from Sandy Gruenberg, which is, and I know you touched a little bit on this topic in the book, but maybe you can share a little bit more about it with us tonight, which is, did Siggy ever return to Europe? And if so, what was his reaction to that experience? And did he want to share that part of his life with his children?
Siggy never returned to Europe. He never returned to Europe, not because he wasn't interested, but because he was so dedicated to building his business that he never wanted to be too far away. Remember, these were days before the internet, you know, before cell phones, before instant communications and technology. So he didn't even like to go too far away from the East Coast on a vacation. He would go up to Kutcher's. That was only a 2.5-hour drive. If there was some problem at the bank, he could get back quickly. But traveling to, you know, Germany or Israel or wherever, that's a 6-8 hour plane ride. That's too long. If there's a problem, he's got to get back right away. So he was, you know, a workaholic in the true sense of 24/7, always on, always on. Part of that, I think, psychologically, we might conjecture it was his way of dealing with the nightmares. You know, by working, constantly working, he maybe thought he could escape some of that. But he never wanted to be too far away from his business. And he took great pleasure in working. You know, work for him was not a chore. It was a joy, you know, and he would work. He took the Sabbath seriously. You know, that was a day of rest, and he really did rest on the Sabbath. But if he didn't go back to Europe, it's not because he didn't want to. It's that he had more important things to do here. And it wasn't to make money. I don't want people to get the wrong impression. Sigi was not avaricious in that way. He wasn't just looking for money for the sake of getting rich. He wanted resources with which to go out and make good on the pledge that he had made when he first arrived in America, to help rebuild the Jewish people, to help restore what had been taken away, and to fight injustice whenever he saw it. That's why he was so dedicated to becoming a success in oil and banking.
Thank you. Yes. You know, I read that part of the book where you talk about his just working to really make a difference. You know, I think, and his customers, you know, just the way that his customers meant everything to him, taking care of them and building this empire based on the bank with the heart, right? You know, the idea.
Yeah, no, he invented that slogan, that logo, the bank with heart, and it was 2 red hearts entwined. That was the symbol of the bank, and it was in all the advertisements. And you know, he'd give away little pins to people as gifts, or put it on a yardstick. The 2 intertwined hearts was on billboards up and down the New Jersey Turnpike.
Yeah, it seemed like he had a view and appreciation for life and the way that we ought to fill life with incredible amounts of love. To bestow that upon people was really ingrained deeply into who he was as a human being, and that's. You know, that was really, I think, a touching moment of the book, to just hear that, you know, banks, when we think of banks, we can think of banks as being like these cold, you know, just faceless conglomerates, right? And
that wasn't Sigi.
And it was not Siggy. And the way that you portrayed his life was that, you know, he really gave a heart to an industry that often feels like it might not have one. And that was a beautiful and touching and touching story. And you could really it really felt like he genuinely cared about every single customer that he had, especially survivors, and especially the Jewish community that was so that was so closely connected to the New Jersey banking, northern part of New Jersey banking industry. So really quite a profound and touching story. So we have Erica Epstein wrote, there were a couple of us here at Bethel who went to Kutsher's and actually met Siggy. Elise and Bob knew him pretty well, and Larry and I met him once. So I see here that Elise wrote she wanted to share a brief story. So why don't I, before we conclude, I'll just give Elise Shep an opportunity to share that since she met him personally.
Terrific.
Quite amazing. Go ahead, Elise. You have to unmute.
So really quick, I know it's late. Thank you, Zach. And Mr. Greene, thank you so much. But we did have the Kutsher's connection with Ziggy. For us, every year, my kids were small. They're not so small now. We went to Kutsher's at the end of August, and we always met this little man with the crazy hair in the elevator. We have 1,000 pins and heart-shaped crystals and bears, and he would just, my kids adored him. We actually had Friday night dinners with him at Kutsher's, and I don't remember him ever, really delving into this. We knew he was a Holocaust survivor, but we certainly had the Kutsher's connection with him. And I wish I knew his whole story, but we were just thrilled to know him, and I cannot wait to read your book. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. He had this little device because he loved to make kids happy. So he'd go fishing. Remember the lake up at Kutsher's? He'd catch a fish on the end of his line, and then he would wait for a young person, a child to come by, and he'd say, "You ever go fishing?" And he'd hand him the pole, and he'd say, "Now watch that little float. If the float goes under, then you got a fish there, and reel him in. You might catch something." So sure enough, because there was already a fish on the hook, the bob would go under the water, and the kid would reel him and say, "Look, Dad, look, I got a fish." So he'd make the kid summer, and it would make Siggy summer too, because he made a kid happy. Thank you for your remembrance.
Well, that's it. That's the time we have for this evening. Joshua, I just want to say again, thank you so much for coming and sharing your journey with Siggy's family and his story, and sharing a little bit of his life and his story with us. Really, it was a pleasure to read your book. It's beautifully written. You really capture an incredible human being who lived a really incredible life, even given the incredible tragedy and trauma that he experienced in Auschwitz. And so I want to thank you for that, and thank you for coming. And I want to thank Phoebe Gross and Sisterhood for putting together this wonderful evening, again, for inviting me to moderate. I hope that everybody will read the book and learn and grow and live out the values that Siggy honored, which was to never forget the lessons of the past, what that can teach us. So thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.